Directed by Eli Craig, we are talking Clown in a Cornfield. This is a 2025 slasher movie. Craig actually directed the horror comedy Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, which I know has been pretty popular, but never really broke out into mainstream success. So this movie is very sort of reminiscent of the Scream franchise and includes, of course, clowns, which have been pretty popular in movies as of late. So, what is the story? Well, it focuses on a single father and his 17-year-old daughter, Quinn, as they move to a small town where the father intends to become the local doctor. Almost immediately, Quinn befriends a group of teenagers that seem to be the troublemakers of the town and are kind of, she's warned against kind of getting involved with them, but nevertheless, they are the most exciting people in the area. So that's who she hangs around with. And there seems to be a kind of local mascot, this Frendo, who is this clown character associated with the past of this town, the industry of this kind of past, this kind of mascot almost. And a series of killings seemingly committed by this kind of Frendo character obviously starts to affect the local populace. This kind of group of kind of teenagers that they're hanging around with make these kind of YouTube videos involving Frendo the clown, which kind of causes some confusion, and ultimately they kind of end up getting blamed for some stuff. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's talk about it. Now, I was actually initially hesitant to kind of watch this movie because just the title alone just sounded a little silly, if I'm honest. It's actually based on a series of novels. I've not read those stories, so I'm going into this fresh. So let's talk about what I think works in this movie's favour. So this is very much in the mould of 90s slashers, I would say. So taking cues from the likes of Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and things like that. So if you are a fan of those type of slasher movies, then I would suggest this is one for you. It's kind of a horror comedy, so there are some quite genuinely funny moments, and a lot of it is kind of based on generational humour. And that is actually one of the themes of this movie. This movie does actually have a couple of themes and sort of little messages, but I would say it's done relatively subtly. So kind of generational differences is one of them. These kind of young people feel trapped within this kind of old dying town, whilst the older people who live there are kind of clinging on to old-fashioned values. You could also say, you could transpose that to sort of political ideologies. You could argue this movie is making commentary on sort of conservative beliefs versus kind of progressive beliefs in sort of obviously a murderous type of way. But I think it's relatively obvious that that's the sort of the themes here that this movie is kind of trying to point out. But yeah, it's not done kind of like a mallet over the head. It's relatively sort of subtle, and you can enjoy this without thinking about maybe any of the kind of the deeper meanings that this movie's trying to kind of put out there. And it is genuinely quite funny at times. One of the things I think this movie does very well is it sort of leans into cliches, but then sort of subverts those cliches. So now I haven't read the book, as I've mentioned, but apparently this is true of the book. So for example, we have this character of Quinn, a 17-year-old girl with her father, her single father, after her mother has died. And I have to say, I quite like their relationship. Yes, she's kind of rebellious against her father, but she still genuinely loves him. They still have a pretty good relationship, and I think some of the kind of the arguments that these kind of have, for example, are quite typical of a teenager against the parents without making the teenager seem completely unreasonable. And I think, again, this is one of the things that this movie does well, is that it has these sort of teen cliches, these teen stereotypes of characters, and they are often blamed for things. Some of it is their fault, but some of it isn't. But they tend to get kind of tarred with that troublemaker kind of like brush, so to speak. And for example, there's a sequence where they want to go and buy booze, and they're underage, so they kind of distract the shopkeeper and take some, but they kind of leave some money on the counter. So yes, they've kind of got this through illicit means, but they didn't necessarily out steal it. So there's some elements like that where I do feel that the movie tries to have some subtleties with characters, even though some of these characters are in cliche roles or doing cliche things that you would have seen in many other movies of its ilk. But I do think they have tried to make these characters a little bit more kind of fleshed out and a little bit more kind of realistic and multifactional, so to speak. So that I all kind of quite liked, I will say. Now, as on top of that, I think the actors here do a pretty decent job. Everyone here, I think, kind of has this sort of performance where they sort of acknowledge that the characters that are playing are on the cliche side, but they still have personality within them, and they still manage to make these characters not seem over the top cliches and still characters within themselves, which you can kind of believe in their roles. So that's all pretty good stuff. It's an interesting mix where this film acknowledges the sort of what you're going to expect of these kind of characters and really lean into those kind of 90s slasher mix, but also having, you know, surprising you with ways that these characters are not quite as obvious maybe than you might necessarily expect, but while still performing those same tasks. It's actually quite clever writing, I've got to say. There are some kind of quite fun deaths. This kind of killer clown situation, that he's using a variety of different weapons, axes, crossbows, chainsaws, and the movie does actually have some fairly kind of bloody deaths, and some of which are kind of played a little bit more comedic, some of which are kind of a little bit more gruesome, but it does sort of seem sort of visceral at times, and arguably you can see a lot of these kind of coming really, but I think that is still, it's still done. If you're a horror slasher fan, I do think this movie really does service those sort of fans who kind of want this kind of type of, action in their sort of slasher film. So that's all pretty good. And as the movie progresses into its kind of third act, we have this kind of twist or reveal, I guess you kind of want to say. And I have mixed feelings on it, but I think it was kind of interesting. I was beginning to think this is maybe where the film was kind of going, but nonetheless, so it's not. It does try to kind of give you. It actually does give you clues. So it's not a complete surprise if you've been paying attention. But I think it sort of worked and it is earned. But nonetheless, I do think it's quite an interesting an idea here, for the most part. I don't think it completely works, as I say, but yeah, it's the movie certainly turns into more of an action type situation, less so than the horror. Towards that kind of the end of the third act. So overall, I've got to say, on the positives, it's actually a fairly kind of well put together movie. The production design is all sort of quite well put together. It looks kind of like nice and shiny, so it doesn't look particularly cheap or anything like that. There's quite a lot of extras, and it does have this kind of like this old town or rural kind of American feel to it. I think. Is a lot of a character in this movie itself. So, it's a fairly decent slasher movie overall. Do I have any critiques with this film? Now, this movie tries to both walk the line between having the cliches that you're going to expect in a kind of slasher movie, which is definitely kind of influenced by the movies of the 90s, and then somewhat kind of, maybe not subverting cliches, but, playing with them a little bit to make them a little less cliche. But overall, if we're being honest, the movie does still fall into cliches. I mean, the story, the characters, who ends up kind of getting killed, who doesn't, it is ultimately exactly what you're going to expect. I mean, yes, some of the subtleties in this movie, some of the character moments, some of the kind of the expectations you're going to have of certain character traits, they've played around with to try and make them a little less obvious. But overall, the broad story still does fall into a very much a cliche slasher style story. So there's not a whole lot of genuine sort of originality in regards to how the story progresses, really. Just a few kind of elements of character work here and there. So it is ultimately, feels very familiar. Now, I quite enjoyed the story and I was engaged, but I do think as the film progresses and the kind of this third act reveal takes place, I have to say, to me that seemed a little silly, if I'm honest. I'm not going to say what that is, but yeah, it seems a little silly, and because it involves you know, multiple people, and it kind of feels, I don't know if this would have been able to kind of be this kind of big secret or what have you, or you know, it seems there's too many moving parts for me to where this would ultimately be a somewhat kind of believable scenario. So yeah, I have to say I think that was a little weaker, and also when we get this element, it does lose that horror element. It kind of ends up being a bit more kind of slapsticky and that sort of thing, and really then transitions to more of a kind of towards an action film rather than a horror. And this movie is never really particularly kind of scary or creepy, but I do think the first two acts has an element of that, and when we get to the third act, I feel it does lose any type of creepiness that it might have garnered. So that there's ultimately that element to it. Some of the comedic aspects I've got to say I quite enjoyed, but again, it might be a bit too comedic for some. Tucker and Dale, of course, was a very, very comedic movie. It's not quite as comedic as that, but nonetheless, it's definitely a funny movie. And again, it has these, you know, arguably it has a few political kind of overtones. And I know some people want their movies to be, you know, politics free. It's subtle, but it is there. I'll give this movie a 7 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.